Welcome back to part 2 of our Imposter Syndrome and Design discussion. My name is Opalia Meade, and I'm one of the co-founders of Design in Color. Design in Color is a collective of architects and designers of culture. Our mission aims to diversify the way architecture is taught and practiced to amplify marginalized communities who've been historically silenced and erased throughout the design process. Today's discussion is in collaboration with two Easies, Nate Robert-Eze, who will be co-moderating with me today. We will be opening up the floor to a Q&A at the end of the panel and would love for you all to share your insights, experience, and thoughts in the chat. We'll also be sending out a poll to familiarize ourselves with who is attending the session today. My team members, Christopher, Ruben, Olga, and Brian are also working in the background to keep the discussion flowing. So we welcome you all into this safe space and are honored to have such a lovely all-women panel lineup who my co-moderator will be introducing this evening. Nate?
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Nate Robert-Eze, and I'm very, very happy to be a part of this exciting conversation today.
I don't know what that means.
I'm an urban designer from Indianapolis, originally from Nigeria. I actually went to Ball State University in Indianapolis. I don't know if we have any Indianapolis people here. Probably not. But that's where I got my undergrad degree in urban planning and development. And then I went on to get my master's as well in urban design. And I currently work at a firm called Meticulous Design and Architecture, where we do a lot of urban design work, urban planning work, and architecture work. And I own a fashion brand called Too Easy. That's the one that's collaborating with this conversation. So let's get right into it. So first of all, thank you all for joining our space dedicated to the astounding voices of women design thinkers. Tonight, we'll be unpacking their experiences and perceptions related to the phenomena of imposter syndrome and their identities as Black women in design. So let's get into the panelists and make sure you all hold your applause to the end. So first panelist is Farida Abubakari. Farida is an associate and licensed architect in Toronto at the global firm HOK. Farida has lived and worked with HOK internationally with a vast portfolio of workspace, higher ed, aviation, justice, and advanced sci-tech projects. She's a board member of HOK's Diversity Council, promoting an equitable and inclusive work environment where everyone can thrive. She's also a community affairs director emeritus of NOMA Atlanta. And serving as a director for NOMA also led her to found BIDA, which is the Black Architects and Interior Designers Association in Canada. BIDA advocates diversity, equity, and inclusion in professions of architecture, interior design, and yes, in Canada. So our next panelist is Denise Shante Brown. As a queer disabled entrepreneur, Denise is a holistic design strategist and founding director of Black Women Flourish. I love that name, by the way. Denise brings forth abundant possibilities for well-being for Black women through collaborative creativity and community-led practices. Her life's work integrates design as a liberatory tool for healing, health, justice, and radical imagination. She currently lives in Baltimore, where she's inspired by the possibilities of more Black women flourishing by design. Last but not least, Natasha Hicks. Natasha is an urban planner and design activist working with Detroit City's Housing and Revitalization Department, where she does work to increase resident housing, stability service access, and stability service access. Her work's grounded in beliefs that design is and should be a force for radical social change, and she looks to change infrastructures of agency for unrepresented and underrepresented communities. She has practiced architecture, exhibition, strategic planning, and policy design professionally, and is passionate about dismantling systems of racial inequality or inequity in built environments. She's organized events elevating voices of Black and Brown designers, including Harvard's Black in Design Conference and Black Spaces spaces, and places, uncomforts. So wherever you are, give a round of applause, snaps, or whatever you can. I know we can't hear you, but let's welcome our wonderful panelists.
Thanks, Nate. So I know Nate gave your professional introduction, but if you all can formally introduce yourself and explain to our audience who you define yourself as, starting with Farida.
So yeah, hi everyone. I'm a Canadian on the line, so I'm here in Toronto, Ontario, and I'm excited to be about this panel. The topic is kind of near and dear to me. It's something that I've experienced throughout my career, and when I heard about the opportunity and the discussion, I welcomed it, especially with these other women that the overlap is there, and we're kind of in the same realm. So I'm excited to kind of unpack that today, and excited to collaborate with Designing in Color. I'm happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
Are we going in order?
Yes.
Okay. Hi, I'm Denise, joining here from Baltimore, founding director of the recently launched Black Women Flourish, where we are using design to shape the future of Black women's health and healing, and really center us in the process of redefining and designing what it means for us to be well. I come with a background of social design from an academic perspective, and have transitioned into design justice. You may be familiar with Design Justice Network, and it's the international network that is doing amazing things as far as centering people who are normally marginalized in the design processes and design decisions. Emergent strategy, other things. I know some of you all from being a part of Black in Design last year, and the panel discussion as far as designing spaces for wellness and joy. And so I'm excited to be a part of this conversation and really talking about what imposter syndrome is and how it impacts the way that we create.
Thanks, Denise. Natasha?
Yep. Hi, everybody. My name is Natasha Hicks. I'm an urban planner and designer. I was based in Detroit, but I'm currently working remote from my hometown of Los Angeles, California, where I was born and raised. I wanted to start off just really briefly touching a little bit on my personal journey, and we'll get more into this, but my career path has been kind of a winding road. I started out in architecture, and now I'm in the space of policy. And I really initially got started in the world of architecture because I was gravitated to this idea of culting a space for folks to belong, and that's initially what brought me to the field. I ended up going to Stanford and doing that. I studied architecture and moved to New York and worked in commercial and residential architecture, and found myself being incredibly unfulfilled. I was working in a time in 2015 that we were being bombarded by visuals of Black violence and the murders of Black bodies, and I kind of recognized that I really went into architecture, wanted to be a designer, not to build $20 million homes for the 1%, but, I was always driven by these two kind of grounding questions of, how can I cultivate spaces of belonging for others? And also how can I use my voice and agency as a designer to dismantle systemic injustice? And that's ultimately what brought me to the nebulous and ill-defined world of urban planning. And I went to graduate school at the GSD, and the two most kind of, I think, impactful things that happened for me in grad school was, first, I was able to kind of build my own definition of what design looks like, and was able to kind of redefine that and realize that, applying design thinking to government infrastructures and policy was something I was really passionate about in terms of thinking about how we dismantle these systems of injustice. And then the other thing is that I found my tribe. I found the African American Student Union and the Black in Design Conference, and to me, that was such a critical. We'll get more into this when we think about sacred space, but just building spaces and cultivating spaces for folks and designers to feel like they belong is such a unique joy, especially in a discipline and and a world where people of color are told that they don't belong. So that's really kind of what drives me in my career right now, is trying to cultivate those spaces.
That is phenomenal. So many of the things that you said ring true for a lot of us here at Design in Color, and it's one of the reasons why we started Design in Color. So jumping right into the discussion, when we look at the definition of imposter syndrome, it's defined typically as a particular sense of unbelonging. So it's based on this idea that you've only succeeded due to, let's say, luck or fortunate circumstances, and not because your necessary talent or qualifications. So one of the first questions that I have for the panelists, and again, I invite everyone in our audience to answer these questions in the chat and share your own experience, because I think it will help the panelists kind of feed off of your personal experience. One of the first questions is, what is your personal definition of imposter syndrome, and what has been your experience with it? And anyone can be free to start off.
I'm the only one that unmuted. Okay. All right. So I think for imposter syndrome, for me, is in architecture, because it's a very critical profession. It starts off like that in academia. A lot of how you design or how you designed before is kind of thrown to the wayside. Your open creative forum that you had by yourself as like a student, and just kind of understanding from high school level, wherever you got in, it's kind of lended a hand to take that away and understand the theory behind it and the people that came before you, and kind of learning from that structure. And then as you start to become more focused on the drawing, there's so much structure to it that they're trying to abide you to, that your creative realm is just kind of destructed again, and you're looking to people to guide you through that process. And I think the crits, the basis of crits from undergraduate to graduate, you're constantly looking for approval. and I think that kind of guides itself to creating that level of imposter syndrome, where not only are you not seeing classmates that look like you and professors that don't look like you, the critiques of things that you might have perceived as the way are unique to you are constantly put in question. So you're always second guessing, thus creating that level of anxiety of, am I even making the right decision? So your decision making is always being put into question. I think that was where it all kind of started for me, and not having that confidence anymore in your decision making for yourself, because you were always looking to make sure that you were aligning with what the status quo was doing, so that you could keep up. I think in architecture, that is a cultural thing that we've kind of created as a norm. And so when you eventually enter into the workplace, it kind of continues that as well into the studio culture, because then again, you're being led by a team that's giving you the guidance of design and management and technical. So I think that for me as an architect, it's a constant struggle. I haven't sorted it out by any means. I think you kind of create the coping mechanisms, but again, it's just a greater of just trying to understand what your thought is and what someone else is, and trying to find the balance in the same way that we do with clients, but with yourself.
Yeah, I think building off of Farida, what you just said about like it's a constant struggle. A very quick anecdote: when I was invited to be on this panel, I was like, why are they inviting me to be on this panel? I'm no expert on imposter syndrome. And I was like, oh girl, this is why we're all here to have this conversation. But I mean, I think for me, imposter syndrome like encapsulates so many different things. Like, of course, throughout my career, I felt that like classic feeling of like, I'm a fraud. But I also think it goes to something a bit like deeper of it's about devaluation. It's like it's a personal devaluation of your worth and yourself and your work. But I think for us as women of color, it's how society has devalued us. And I think the constant narratives and messages that we are presented with growing up in American society, that we don't belong. And I think back to even being in high school and getting into Stanford and having everybody tell me that the only reason I got in was because I'm Black. And, that feeling of being the affirmative action, like applicant or hire, and constantly combating that internally of like, am I here because I'm awesome, or am I here because I'm a stat to you? So I mean, I think I'm always like combating that voice in my head, and also trying to recognize when it is actually society that has taught me and told me that to devalue myself. And for me, it's a constant like unlearning journey. And I think especially in architecture, there's just so much that you have to combat it. Even when you think about being in school and the language that we use in like architectural theory, I was like, did I miss the book on all of these language and terms? Because this sounds like a completely different language. Or I think about, you know, all the times that I'm in a meeting and I'm like, should I speak up? Is my voice valued in this space? I think you know, imposter syndrome, it shows up in both these very profound ways, and also it's like this constant hum in the background of trying to quiet that voice saying you're not doing enough, you're not enough.
Yeah, that resonates with me a lot. It's taken me back to what you said earlier, Natasha, about belonging. I think, you know, the seeds of imposter syndrome seem to have grown since childhood, as, you know, being a part of different spaces and places, and that evolution of adulting, I think. Right now, I've been seeing imposter syndrome a little more from this place of taking on oppressive perspectives that don't necessarily belong to me. And so I've seen it shown up in the academic space for sure, entering the graduate program where I got my degree in social design, and being the only Black woman a part of that cohort in a city like Baltimore, and being the one who was really like advocating for Black women to have value, and the one focusing on Black women and Black issues. And so it was like these layers of, I see or want there to be value seen as far as Black women's contributions to design and our creativity, and how it supports us in our well-being, while also trying to sustain my well-being in an academic space like that can be pretty toxic, and demands a lot of my own care. And it's like, well, what is this this sort of tapping into an inner fortitude that we have to sort of learn to cultivate and grow ourselves in order to be well while trying to do the work of design. And so recent experiences that I've encountered has been around even just publicly introducing a business as a Black woman entrepreneur. We know, or some of us may know, the stats on Black women not being funded and getting capital or access to capital, and being profiled and discriminated against and looked at a certain way as far as what we can do and how successful our businesses will be. And doing something that was so close, so personal, that is, again, like trying to show value in what we have and who we are as Black people and our contributions to the field, but also wanting to shift to stop building the narrative in ways that we have to kind of prove our worth to other people, specifically white people, and to just do the work and celebrate ourselves. And so I've been in this place of, how can I continue to celebrate the Black women who are part of this, celebrate myself in the work, find ways that I can remember my own contributions, unique gifts, and center that in the process.
That was fabulous. I relate to so much of it, especially always being one of the few, or if not the only, Black person representing for the entire race in all my educational experiences, and oftentimes within the professional world as well. One of the next questions I have for you all is, what are the triggers, if any, and how do they relate to your identity as a Black woman in design?
You're already unmuted. I'm not going to go first. Go ahead.
Natasha?
Okay, I'll I have a lot of triggers, so I'll choose one. One of the things that really makes me like scream and physically, I think I have a visceral reaction is when I'm called an expert. And it's not that I don't have confidence in the skills that I have. It's just, I think for me, that word has so much weight of how we as a culture define who is an expert and who has expertise and the harmful narratives that are around that. So I remember I was working in with the city of Charleston for a summer fellowship around housing, and that was really my first like soiree into the housing world. And I came in and they're like, oh, you're from Harvard, you're the expert in housing. And I was like, oh, no, like this is really, my first gig, and I'm here to learn from you. I'm here to learn from the citizen experts. And so much I think of our work as planners is to lean on the expertise of the people that we serve and the communities that we serve and the communities we want to elevate. So I always have a lot of trouble with that word because it feels somewhat harmful to me. And I think we just have to redefine what that word means to us. So that's, I think, one of the major things. Whenever I hear somebody call me an expert, I get quite squeamish.
Yeah, I can piggyback on that. I think with a level of like the work we do in design, when clients come to you, they immediately think that you're the be all and all to kind of guide through the process. So I think with clients, just kind of that expectation already is like being young in the profession, you're still learning. So I'm always careful of taking that on. I think that always is where you second guess your thoughts, but as you start engaging with people, you understand that you're here for a reason, you're at the table for a reason. For me, a lot of my work and what I've done, even when I was working in the US, I spent some time in Atlanta and I worked a little bit with a project in DC, and for the past couple of years, is that a lot of the work that I do is very white male dominated. And so when I enter the room, I'm not just the only woman, I'm the only minority in a lot of cases. So when you're client facing, it's incredibly hard to kind of overcome that first meetings. And I find that for me, it takes me some time to kind of engage in a way that I feel that I'm exuding confidence, I guess, when you first kind of have those moments. So those happen very often in the beginning stages of projects. I'm always anxious more so of how people are perceiving me, because it's probably the first time they're seeing someone like me in the room. And so I'm always trying to overcompensate, but make sure that we're all comfortable with me, if I'm comfortable with me being there. And I think that is something that I'm still working through, but now understanding that it's a matter of me continuing to be in those rooms so that level of uncomfort becomes not even a real thing anymore. So yeah, that's kind of my triggers, just the visible differences when I enter a room.
Yeah, all of those I connect with as well. I'm sure if we all had a list, we'd have a lot of similarities. Maybe we should make a list later, go over it. I think something that was interesting when I was thinking about this question earlier is that a trigger for me is when someone is constantly questioning my worth or why I'm in a place. And an experience that I had was actually connected to the Black in Design conference when I was, wanting to celebrate and talk about the opportunity. And someone was like, but how did you get that? How did that happen? And I was like, ouch at first, and then I've done, internally had been navigating so much already after receiving the call and receiving the invite, loving, Black in Design so much after having an experience and being excited and honored for the invitation. And then I experienced something like that where it made me like step back a bit and does this person not think that I was worth the invite? Should I not be someone who's a part of this panel and conversation. And that can actually contributed to something, a piece that I actually created to take with me to the Black in Design conference, that was like this book of affirmations and reminders, little tokens or pieces that were a part of my journey up until that point, so that I can continue to remind myself that I actually have my own evidence and proof as to why I absolutely belong on this panel and should be a part of this conversation. And all of the outside noise that we get a lot in relationship to what I then let kind of seep into me throughout that time. I think that's the relationship that happens, is that it's a lot of like outside perspectives that we are pulling in and sitting with and questioning and thinking about, is it true? Is it not? I don't know. And I have to do this, my own assessment of my history, of the things that I have done, and do this correction of, no, actually, I belong here. I can do this. I actually have this list of experiences where I've done it before, and I can do it again. And I should be celebrating this.
And just to piggyback on that, like, I think it also comes from our upbringing, right? Like, I think as Black women, when you're growing up, like for me, I grew up in the Middle East, I grew up in Canada. So I've always kind of been the other or the token person. And so my parents as Africans were always very cognizant of that, of me being in white spaces, and always trying to make sure that we're on our best behavior, and always cognizant of reading the room and making sure people were comfortable. And I think we've kind of, at least for me, I've carried this into adulthood, where I'm constantly empathizing and worrying about the other people in the room to make sure that they are comfortable. And I think just carrying that, seeing those, like, not the trauma, but, you know, these things that we carry with us from childhood that are learned behaviors, and how it translates into adulthood is very interesting.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting viewpoint. I'm just thinking back to our imposter syndrome with our male counterparts, and they never mentioned anything about, you know, making other people feel comfortable within the room. So I think that's also a difference that women in design and men in design have, is kind of women often carry on this burden of, you know, is everyone else comfortable? That men are just kind of trying to oftentimes pave the way. And I know some of my own feelings of imposter syndrome happened in white-led spaces in which I was questioned on, are you sure you want to be an architect? Or if I did something well, it's like, are you sure you did that? You didn't get any help. So that has always kind of been a trigger for me. So my next question to you all is, does your feelings of imposter syndrome more relate to personal feelings within, like, upbringing, or is it influenced by being in a white male-dominated field?
I feel like it's a mixture of both. They're interchangeable for some reason. You can't really get away from either. Again, with the upbringing, that internal thing, you can't turn it off. You can try to manage it in ways that you learn or counsel yourself through. But I think the white spaces, because they're so prevalent, our clients, like, you know, like the people that we seek out, they don't look like us. And, you know, and the people that in corporate world of architecture, it's just not there yet. It's slowly coming. Like, we're shifting to focusing on women-led businesses, minority-owned businesses for at least consultants and contractors. But I think ultimately wealth is still not spread to people that look like us yet. So it will take some time before we walk into a room and see people that are like us. And so I think when we start anything new as an architect, you're always cognizant of that you always want to try to seek out those clients. And I've been kind of spending a lot of time trying to do that, because I think it's important for them also, because we feel as though they're also having imposter syndrome. In a sense, we're all kind of circulating this trauma. So if there's a way to assist that community. So yeah, I think that it's interchangeable, the two.
Yeah, I would echo that. I mean, I think I kind of spoke to this before, but I mean, it's impossible for me to divorce my experience in my professional path from being a Black woman. You know, it's and also the narratives that are fed to us throughout, from our childhood to, you know, throughout our professional journey. You know, like the experiences I had growing up of being in a store and being asked, you know, do you work here? And still think the same thing that happens to me now. Like that experience is something that I carry with me, and it feeds that voice in my head that says that you're not enough. And I think for me, it's such a combination of the two, of the microaggressions that you feel throughout working in such a male, white dominated field, and then also, I mean, just I think inherently as designers, like you're putting out something that is so personal, and it is an extension of yourself and your self-expression. And I think there's something like inherent in that, in our field and our discipline, that makes us even a little bit more vulnerable, and I think a little bit more insecure of like, you know, the response and the critique to it is so, you know, it's really like it's an extension of yourself. So I think that also contributes to it as well.
Yeah, and seeing like design broadly, and thinking about when and where we're allowed to put ourselves into the work, I think that plays a role as well. I do want to touch on a little bit on the beginnings, the sort of earlier things from childhood that we don't really want to talk about too much, and how it shows up today. But I think a lot of it is, well, not a lot of it, I can speak for myself. Growing up in a really small town, single mom, father in prison before he eventually passed away. And so I think those instances where we're talking about like Black families, the spaces and places that we grow up in. I was in a more rural kind of community, in a income-based, you know, living situation at home, and trying to nurture aspects of my creativity in ways that I knew how as a child. And I just think about, you know, imagination at that time and things that I got really excited about, and felt confident within myself, and how as I grew up, those things started to slip away. And they started to slip away because of, I don't know, certain white teachers that I had growing up in elementary school, when I would get excited about something that I was interested in, and how the system and structures that we're in, especially as Black children, children of color, in schools, my particular school, I didn't have a single Black instructor. And so how like being kind of molded through that process into trying to shape me into leading or having a career that they thought I should have, and how that influenced the way I saw myself, and then what I thought that I could do, based on what they said. And they're the influencers, right? They're the adults, the people who we're looking to for guidance. And so it really I don't really think my own sense of confidence in trying to steer away or define what the possibilities of design and finding my voice in that, in a place that felt true to me, really came until later in grad school. So that's like much later. And what I talk about like inner fortitude, and that place of just trying to return to self and continue asking questions, and being around support systems and grandmothers and you know, other people who are, if we have them, you know, are trying to continue planting seeds and remind us of why we're here, and in the brilliance that exists within us and within our communities as Black people.
Ooh, Denise, that just like hit me so deep. I feel like there's so much overlap that I feel in terms of my experience, and, you know, growing up in my childhood, being lower middle class, and my mom was a public school teacher, and she herself, you know, had a lot of an internal struggle of like valuing public education, but also wanting to give me and my sister as much opportunities as possible. And she fought really hard to get us scholarships for private schools here in LA. And I was the scholarship kid since I was 5 years old through college. And that feeling of being other within these like highly elite institutions is like its own, like I feel very privileged to have the education that I had, but it is its own trauma of going through that experience. And then similarly, you know, being biracial and growing up, you know, being told I'm not Black enough, I'm not white enough, being called an Oreo, the whole like kind of experience of really just like not feeling comfortable with myself. And it really wasn't until grad school, and again, this importance of like finding your tribe and finding the people that you can be your authentic self with, and finding your like the co-conspirators and collaborators to navigate this world, is like, that was such a transformative experience. And I can't believe it happened at Harvard of all places, because talk about a traumatic place. But I was able to find that crew and group of people that really allowed me to build the confidence to be comfortable with my voice and my practice. And it didn't happen until, you know, later in life.
I think that's so interesting, because when you talk about, you know, being educated in these kind of elite institutions, when you look at the field of architecture, it is very elitist. There's so much gatekeeping just to call yourself an architect. There's so much gatekeeping within the education process. And a lot of the reasons why the representation is not there is it is not a cheap field. It is very expensive as a student. So being within this kind of elitist organization, one of the things that Design and Color is really big on is this concept of sacred space. And this being a space where one can be safe and true to self. So everyone's idea of sacred space is different and personal to them. But when you think of this idea of imposter syndrome, it's almost like a disruptor of one's sacred space. So what is your personal definition of sacred space, and how have you managed to create it or find it despite feelings of imposter syndrome?
For me, it's like our community, honestly. When I was in grad school, I found out about the Black design at the Harvard School, and I went in my last year of grad studies, and it was the first time I'd ever been in a room full of Black architects. And I wasn't just excited, I felt freed in a sense of just like this was normal. My whole life I've never experienced this, and this can happen. And that exposed me to members of NOMA. And so I went to my first conference months later and in Atlanta in 2011, and just meeting architects that were thriving and Black and in big firms and SOM and Gensler and HOK. I was like, this is where I'm supposed to be right now. And it didn't matter what I was experiencing in school. It didn't matter what I was experiencing from trauma or my studies. It was like, this is the safe space. I'm creating this for myself. And so when I eventually moved to Atlanta, I joined NOMA immediately. I didn't know anyone in Atlanta. It didn't matter, because they immediately became that family. They became that support system. They became the mentors, because it was natural and organic. I didn't even have to ask for it. They were just people that looked out for me by nature of us being the other. And so when I moved back to Toronto, I wanted to kind of emulate that same space, because I noticed that there was a lot of women that were in undergraduate studies and that were going to not have that support, because our field in Canada is very similar to the States. It's not that different. Like, there are no women of color in leadership in architecture in Canada. And so I felt like if I could create this safe space, then other people would thrive and they wouldn't have to deal with the things that we dealt with, and just looking at the pipeline and trying to make a zone from them. So, yeah.
Oh, go ahead. You want to go, Natasha?
I'll come back.
I had to really think about this, and I went out journaling earlier at the park before this call. And so what I wrote in my journal, I said that sacred space is a soft place to land. It's where I'm able to be and create from a place of authenticity, and it's free of mental debris that doesn't belong to me. And so I think this sweeping out, I talked about this before, of just like oppressive perspectives and things that aren't mine. And I'm doing this motion, it's like sweeping out, clearing space. I think that it's a part of that for sure. And tapping into that or accessing that for me comes from a deeply spiritual space, like a spiritual practice. And so it's been really important. I even noticed, like, before going into a meeting or before have a very important conversation or going to a studio space, any space where I know it's not going to be filled with Black women or other people of color, to especially take time out in my morning or day to sit on the mat, to meditate, to do tarot, to just be quiet, whatever that looks like, and remaining in my center and knowing what's true for me before I walk into spaces where I'm going to be, wounded a little bit, and maybe a lot, depending on where I'm going. And so it's like this, how can I protect myself and make sure that I'm also doing the work that I need to do to sustain my own well-being and stay rooted and grounded in what I know is true for me. Because there have been so many situations where I haven't done that work, and I haven't had an off day or something, life happens, can't sustain those practices all the time or every single day, and have walked into a space where it was probably the day where I needed it the most. And I just think that the care that we give ourselves, and also being able to be supported by friends and folks who are also nurturing themselves, and we can support each other and remind each other, that is something that we need to do.
That was so beautiful, Denise, and I just want to say, like, an amen to that. I mean, I think both what Farida and Denise said about, I think I similarly defined sacred space as a space where I feel most free and most liberated. And the first things that come to mind with that term sacred space is, I think about my first time ever being at Afropunk Music Festival, and just the freedom of being in that space, and the invitation to be just authentically yourself, and free of societal worries. And I think similarly, the Black in Design Conference, and creating spaces like Spaces and Places, I think that invitation for folks to just bring your full self, but also really elevating the importance of Black joy, I think for me is so critical. I think it's not, I think that, being in that space in Black in Design, what's so great, not only just being like, wow, like, look at this beautiful room, but it's the joy of seeing people kind of like reunite or create new connections and building new coalitions and the networks that are formed afterwards. And I think what was interesting when I first saw this question is, I struggled a bit, because I was like, is imposter syndrome disrupting sacred space, or is sacred space disrupting imposter syndrome? I really want to be in a world and a space where the majority of my day is inhabiting that sacred space. But I don't think I'm there yet. And that's kind of my work, is trying to figure out how to cultivate those sacred spaces and bring my authentic self to my everyday practice, especially in a field that doesn't allow us to do that. And, trying to find the ways to cultivate those spaces in small ways. So, I mean, that's kind of what I've been thinking about with that.